Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're getting into something really complex and nuanced. We're talking about global mobility, and specifically the calculus that many African migrants make when they're choosing a destination. Because we're going to challenge a really common assumption, the idea that people just, inevitably move towards the countries with the highest quality of life rankings. Okay, let's unpack this. If it was really all about maximizing wealth and comfort, you'd expect to see a near-perfect curve, right? The richest nations would just get the highest proportional inflow. But the patterns we actually see in African migration, well, they tell a much, much more complicated story.
And that complication, that's really the core of our deep dive today. And I want to be clear, we're presenting an interpretation. This is a way to view these observable patterns, not some final academic conclusion. Our mission is to explore whether accessibility, the actual possibility of entering and getting a foothold in a country, often takes precedence over high living standard rankings.
Over ultimate comfort.
Exactly. And to test this idea, we're going to compare two different models. On one hand, the United States, and on the other, those highly affluent, often smaller European states. But we have to be so clear up front. This reflects patterns we see among a majority of migrants, especially those moving over long distances. It's not every single person's story. In many cases, for a large share of migrants, this structural view holds up. But we're analyzing a flow, not just a collection of individual choices.
And we really wanted to engage with this because this perspective, it fundamentally shifts the lens. It moves the focus away from just individual hopes and more toward systemic barriers. So if you're listening, you might disagree with this, and that's absolutely part of the discussion. We're here to try and understand the structural realities driving these huge global flows. So let's start with the paradox. Why do some of the wealthiest countries, the ones that top all the UN Human Development Indexes, the ones with the highest GDP per capita, why do they often show lower proportional migration numbers from Africa compared to other places that might rank, significantly lower?
Well, it really boils down to what that key metric, GDP per capita, actually measures versus what we assume it measures when we talk about migration. GDP per capita is an excellent snapshot. It's great. It measures quality of life, public services, economic output, basically the wealth inside a system that's already stable and highly regulated.
Inside the system.
Right. What those rankings fundamentally fail to measure is the friction of that system. They don't tell you about the visa process, the cost of legal pathways, the strictness of residency rules, or the system's tolerance for uncertainty when new people arrive. And that's the disconnect we see.
So the economic data describes this beautiful house, the perfect garden, but it's completely ignoring the security system, the height of the fence, and maybe most importantly, the price of the key.
That is exactly the point. The data described the reward after you get in. But the critical, sometimes life or death decision to migrate is made entirely before you get in. A rich country is desirable, of course it is. But if the structural barriers to access are nearly insurmountable, then that high ranking becomes functionally irrelevant for the person trying to get in.
I can see the flaw in that assumption now. So the high GDP ranking isn't wrong, it's just
It's incomplete.
incomplete. But does that imply that migrants aren't aware of, say, the better social safety nets in some countries?
Not at all. And we have to be really careful here. This isn't to suggest migrants are ignorant of economic data. They're often acutely aware of it. But they're also operating with an acute awareness of access data, the real chance of successfully arriving and integrating. And in their immediate calculation, that's far more relevant than the size of a country's welfare fund. So yeah, the rankings are not irrelevant. They are just profoundly incomplete as a predictor of where people will go.
Okay, that brings us to definitions. And this is where it gets really interesting. We need to be crystal clear here. Let's really delineate the difference. What do we mean by living standards versus accessibility in this context?
Okay, let's be precise. Living standards, or what we can call ultimate comfort, that refers to the quality of life once you are securely and legally inside a mature, stable system. That's your excellent public health, strong social safety nets, predictable laws, low crime rates. It's about minimizing risk once you're settled.
Okay, so that's the destination's quality.
Exactly. Now, accessibility, that's completely different. It relates to the initial possibility and the perceived ease of physically entering and gaining a sustainable foothold. This has less to do with the comfort level and more to do with, how porous the border is, the variety of entry channels, legal, humanitarian, temporary, and the realistic chance of changing your status once you're inside.
Which means those highly regulated systems, the ones that get those top living standard rankings, are, well, they're designed to favor certainty. They prioritize stability above everything.
They absolutely do. Highly regulated systems, like, say, many of the Nordics, they're architected to minimize irregularity. They favor certainty, which means they're looking for very specific inputs. Highly qualified people with skills that plug neatly into specialized gaps in their economy.
They're efficient.
Very efficient systems, but they are also less forgiving of, let's say, a messy arrival or a slow, gradual integration process. In contrast, more flexible, more expansive systems like the United States or even certain countries in the global South, they're often just better at structurally absorbing uncertainty. They might offer lower initial living standards, sure, but they provide different ways for a newcomer to get a toehold and start to integrate. So we frame this comparatively. Some systems are more regulated, others are designed for stability rather than absorption capacity. It's just a different design choice.
So let's apply this to a specific case. What about those smaller, very wealthy European states, the ones that are always on the best places to live lists? Why do they attract comparatively fewer African migrants?
We have to approach this through a purely structural, institutional lens. This isn't about intentional exclusion or hostility. It's the logical outcome of a very specific system design.
They're built to be selective.
They have to be. I mean, think about the structural factors. First, their small population size means they have small overall labor markets. So when the system is small, the capacity for varied kinds of employment is just very limited,
Oh, yeah.
especially in sectors that traditionally employ new migrants.
Right, they don't have room for generalists. They're looking for a very specific tool to fill a very specific hole.
Precisely. And their labor markets are often highly specialized, requiring extremely high technical thresholds. If your economy is based on, say, advanced pharmaceuticals, the bar for entry is just incredibly high.
Which filters the pool of potential newcomers down to a tiny few.
Exactly. And third, they maintain high regulatory thresholds for entry and residence. The whole system is built on precision, on comprehensive social security. The idea of gradual, informal integration is extremely difficult for that system to manage. And finally, a lot of their mobility systems are really optimized for EU-centric movement, not for high-volume migration from third countries. So the key phrase here is this does not make these countries hostile, it makes them selective. And if a migrant's primary need is access, these selective systems are just functionally less desirable no matter how high they rank for comfort.
But hold on, isn't there an argument that this selectivity just pushes the pressure somewhere else? That by making their nations so hard to enter, these wealthy states are basically externalizing the global absorption burden onto other countries?
That's a crucial question, a real challenge to this analysis. The structural reality is yes, if movement is necessary for survival and door A is locked, pressure will inevitably build on doors B, C, and D. And that pressure often lands on systems that are either larger, less regulated, or have those existing diaspora networks that help people get in.
Which brings us perfectly to our contrast case, the United States. It's a rich country, obviously, but it doesn't always top the quality of life charts, especially next to those meticulous European systems. Yet it consistently attracts a massive share of African migration. So what are the structural factors there that enable access?
We have to look at the U.S. neutrally here, just focusing on its scale and its capacity for absorption. The key difference is volume and variety. The U.S. system offers multiple, diverse migration channels. Even if those channels are slow, complex, contradictory, they exist. You have pathways for skilled workers, family, humanitarian claims, and of course the diversity visa lottery.
So it's not one tightly controlled door. It's more like a huge building with lots of doors, windows, and, maybe some cracks in the foundation.
That's a good way to put it. And that vastness extends directly to the labor market. It's the world's largest, most varied labor market. So this capacity for varied employment means it can absorb people at every skill level. It doesn't require pre-certified expertise for every single person who arrives. It offers work almost immediately, even if it's low wage. And this is critical. The U.S. has a historical structural tolerance for a certain degree of informality. The regulatory state is there, of course, but the sheer scale of the country means that, in practical terms, the system allows new arrivals to put down economic and social roots even before their legal status is fully sorted out.
Okay, I have to challenge that a bit. Doesn't that tolerance for informality just become a recipe for widespread exploitation and terrible labor conditions?
Yeah.
Is access at that cost really a good thing?
That is a necessary point of tension here. You're right. And informal systems absolutely carry massive risks of exploitation. This analysis doesn't claim the U.S. offers a better initial life than, say, Sweden. It argues that the system is more accessible. For a migrant whose main goal is getting a foothold and sending remittances home quickly, that capacity to absorb irregularity can outweigh the initial hardship. The calculus prioritizes arrival over comfort. And we can't forget the role of established diaspora networks. They provide essential infrastructure, housing, job connections, financial help, language support. It's huge. The U.S. system allows people to arrive gradually rather than perfectly.
That really forces us to look at the survival logic behind this. If someone knows country A has amazing schools, but country B has an open, informal market, why prioritize the market? What's the rationale behind putting access before that initial hardship?
We have to frame this not as desperation, but as highly rational survival logic. A sophisticated risk calculation. For someone facing extreme economic precarity or instability at home, the single biggest risk isn't temporary poverty where they're going. It's not getting out. It's not securing that foothold at all.
Okay.
So in practical terms, the goals are about immediate function. Number one is remittances, the ability to get a job, any job, and start sending money home to support family. That's the first and most critical measure of success.
It's a responsibility calculus, first and foremost.
Precisely. And second is family responsibility. Migration is often a long-term strategy for the whole family. Securing a toehold is the first step toward future family reunification. That outweighs one's own initial comfort. Third is the hope of gradual legalization. We see this across several African diasporas, the belief that you can transition from informal to formal status over time. And that hope is often more realistic in a large, flexible system.
A system that has political processes to deal with large, irregular populations.
Exactly. And finally, it's just fundamental risk management.
Yeah.
The need to mitigate the immediate risks at home economic, environmental conflict means the quality of life index of the destination is secondary to the security of just getting there.
That completely changes how you view the decision-making process. It moves away from simple economics and into survival strategy and risk mitigation. So what does this all mean for the bigger picture? Let's pause our analysis for a moment and pose some open questions for you, the listener, to think about.
Yeah, there are several big questions that come out of this access over comfort framework. First, if we accept this framework, is accessibility fundamentally a more powerful driver of global migration flows than ultimate comfort? Second, should destination systems, particularly in the global north, be designed to allow for this sort of imperfect entry and gradual integration, more like the U.S. model? Or should they prioritize high regulatory certainty like many rich European states? Third, and this goes back to your earlier point, are very rich yet highly regulated countries unintentionally exporting migration pressure? Are they shifting the burden of absorption onto more accessible destinations? And finally, is the U.S. system truly unique? Or is it simply the last large, flexible system of its kind still standing in the wealthy global north, making it the default pressure release valve? And we really encourage thoughtful, respectful disagreement with the perspective we've laid out.
This has been a really thought-provoking deep dive. The core idea that access often trumps comfort. It provides a powerful, often overlooked lens to view these essential global movements.
And again, this perspective does not explain every migration story. It doesn't define every individual's hopes. But it may help explain why certain large-scale patterns persist, even when the surface economic data might suggest they shouldn't. Migration flows so often reflect global structural realities, institutional design, not individual failure.
So we'll leave you with this final thought. When a nation prioritizes high national prosperity and perfect regulatory certainty, does that success inevitably come with the cost of building high regulatory barriers, thereby guaranteeing low accessibility? It's a profound question about the trade-off between institutional stability and human necessity. Thank you for joining us.